It shouldn't just be about acquiring knowledge, but also about learning how to think.
We've elevated thinking to an important position, and instead of just regurgitating content.
While these principles are being taken up by educators and business leaders, the critics are gathering.
The Bono does not quote anybody in any of his works except himself.
Good thinking. That's our story tonight.
Live from Canberra, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to the program. According to Plato, Socrates was certain of only one thing, his own ignorance. Plato, of course, developed his own philosophy, which in essence says the universe is made up of eternal and changeless forms, which, if studied, give knowledge and understanding. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, was more material and thought in terms of scientific deductions rather than Plato's metaphysical speculations. But the three fathers of modern philosophy are regarded as being narrow thinkers by our guest tonight, Edward de Bono. He describes them as the Greek gang of three. In 1967, de Bono invented the term lateral thinking, which now has its own dictionary meaning, a way of thinking by making associations with apparently unrelated areas rather than by one logical train of thought. De Bono has since written a great many books and claims credit for influencing prime ministers and presidents, even the future of the modern Olympics, the latest development in computers and a host of other achievements. We'll meet Edward de Bono in a moment, along with perhaps his strongest critic. The only thing they agree on, it seems, is that education systems teach knowledge, but not how to think. But first, this report on some practical examples of de Bono's thinking from Andrew Fowler.
The pupils here at Wavell High School in Brisbane have been learning what's called a new way to think. It's based on the theories of Edward de Bono, who's probably best known for his concepts of lateral thinking. It abandons the traditional system of problem solving. Instead, the problem's attacked from several different angles.
This afternoon in Modern History, I'd like to continue that theme of the family. And
Jenny Naylor is the coordinator of the de Bono system at the school.
I think the major advantage has been that students are more aware of the process of thinking, and we've elevated thinking to an important position, and instead of just regurgitating content.
To understand just what Wavell High is up to, take a look at this modern history class. They're trying to discover what elements go to make up a good family and whether marriage contracts should be renewable every 5 years.
Plus, minus and interesting factors.
Instead of just discussing the issue, the class works to a formula. In the jargon of de Bono, they do a PMI, examining the pluses and the minuses. They then go to examine other facts which are considered neither pluses nor minuses. First, the pluses.
If marriage contracts had to be renewable, it'd be easier to get out of a marriage, out of a bad marriage in particular. I mean, if there was abuse, any sort of emotional abuse or physical, it'd be very easy, you wouldn't have to worry about it. And also save on legal fees.
There'd be a boom within the marriage industry because there'd have to be more weddings if people were changing partners a lot. Could lead to more churches.
Would you like to tell us your minus factors now then, Kelly?
Just said the family unit would basically disappear because this proposal undermines the whole principle of marriage.
De Bono says it's very hard to come up with genuinely true ideas about a topic if you just use words that are related to that. If you're talking about the family and then talk for a while about the mother or the children. But rather, if you randomly associate some words, then the kids will come up with some genuinely interesting ideas.
Each group of students is given a different set of words to link with the word family. For example, glass and gold. De Bono dictates that the sound po should link the two words to help the thinking process.
Family glass, we said was fragile. One crack can lead to the whole unit shattering. If there's not a certain level of clarity, secrets tend to fester and sort of lead to dishonesty among the family. family per gold. We said it was, family life was valuable in the sense that it needs stability and security.
The views are then discussed by the class, the individual student free to make up his or her own mind.
Now, I would think that the De Bono system is a way of nurturing lateral thinking, and then if one wants to pursue a certain line, then of course the linear pattern of thinking then can operate as well.
From the students, there's a degree of scepticism.
To some degree, we do these processes anyway. I mean, in our subconscious, whether it be.
I found my grades sort of picked up a bit, especially in writing, being able to sort of see other different issues and that you wouldn't have thought of before.
I think because we were so old when we were introduced to it, we were a bit sceptical. But I think as we've got on, I found the strength of it is that it puts labels on these thinking skills that we've already had.
While the students at Wavell High may have embraced some of De Bono's thinking, others are strongly critical.
De Bono does not quote anybody in any of his works except himself. So we have no idea where he's drawn this information from except out of his own head. These things are things we normally do. I mean, they're common sense. There's nothing remarkable about them. There's nothing terribly original about them.
The management of this magnesium processing plant at Rockhampton, north of Brisbane, recognises that De Bono doesn't have all the answers. But management is impressed by his system of separating out the elements of a problem.
What people like myself are looking for are situations where that information can actually be used to improve the way a business operates. And he's really the first person who's managed to do that.
Both management and the shop floor have been sent on what the company calls action thinking courses. The course is strongly based on De Bono's 6 thinking hats. Each hat allows the participants of a debate to play a different role.
We've based our course very solidly on that piece of work to get them to identify when they're thinking emotionally or positively or creatively, and try and give them those tools to work through improvement projects on the plant.
In the electrofusing section of the plant, Paul Donaldson was posed with a problem. As this pot containing red-hot magnesia rock revolved, it took with it the hose which provided water to cool it down. To stop the hose being wrapped around the pot and snapping, it was held in place by a series of wires and pulleys. The problem with the system, it was time-consuming and dangerous, because each time the pot was changed, Paul had to climb up and unhook them. The answer was simple.
Just a matter of welding a stop from the shroud at the top to hit on the ring main to stop it rotating with the mantle. Instead of a system of wires and pulleys, we just put a mechanical stop there, and that was enough to hold it.
Paul Donaldson isn't sure how he came up with the solution. He certainly believes the action thinking program helped him think more clearly. De Bono's critics might disagree and point to just common sense as a solution to many of our problems.
That report from Andrew Fowler, and now let me introduce our guests. Dr. Edward De Bono invented the term lateral thinking in 1967 and is the founder and director of the Cognitive Research Trust. His methods for teaching lateral thinking have been used by schools, governments, giant corporations around the world. His latest book, Teach Your Child How to Think, propounds his thesis that not enough education systems teach children just that. Professor Richard Paul is the director and founder of the Centre for Critical Thought at Sonoma State University in California. He chairs the National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking in the US and has been teaching the subject in America for the past 14 years. His latest book, Critical Thinking, What Every Person Needs to Survive in a Rapidly Changing World, discusses the need for a logical and scientific approach to the teaching of thinking. And Richard Paul joins us from Minneapolis. Now, Edward De Bono, I know that you've written extensively and whole books on this topic, but what is the essence of how you would teach children to think?
I think there's two levels, two things to look at. One is the underlying basis of what happens in thinking, and secondly, how you end up with something very simple, and I stress very simple and practical. The underlying essence is rather more complicated. In 1969, I wrote a book called The Mechanism of Mind, which looks at how the nerve networks in the brain allow information to organize itself into patterns, stable patterns, as a self-organizing system. That book perhaps was about 20 years ahead of its time. In fact, probably the leading physicists in the world read that book and said, that's interesting, that's 10 years before mathematicians started looking at chaos and so on. Now, that's a very important basis, because if we look at how the brain handles information, how perceptions are formed, then we can start designing thinking tools, rather like the random word method, which, if you look at it in terms of a passive system, would be total nonsense. In a self-organizing system is perfectly logical. Maybe we'll come back to that later. But at the end of the day, you need to come out with something very simple, very practical, like the PMI, like the 6 hats methods. These are tools. And in teaching thinking, one of the big difficulties is transfer. You can have people having a wonderful discussion on a subject, but unless they can transfer it to something else, nothing happens. So, for example, we have children who learn PMI in school, and then we get reports from the parents. The parents are about to change cities, move to a new job, change the car, and the 11-year-old will sit the parents down and say, well, have you done a PMI? Let's do it together. So the idea of tools, the tool method, is that they're transferable. You can take them to new situations. So the children practice the tools on a whole variety of situations, build up skill in the tools, and then apply them. Interestingly, on the news, your Prime Minister is visiting a big steel mill in Korea. That's probably Pohang, where I was some years ago, and they asked me to teach a class of children at exactly that steel mill. And through interpreters, we were doing a PMI, and I drew a figure with an arm coming out of the chest and said, let's do a PMI. Plus points, you could climb a ladder, hold the tools, you could hold someone and punch them, and so on. Minus points, one little girl of 9 says, you know, she said, when you get old and you have arthritis, you'd have yet another place to have arthritis. And within a few minutes, they picked up this tool and they could apply it to anything.
Okay, Richard, Paul, before we look at how you would teach children to think, what is wrong with how Edward de Bono would go about it?
Well, as you know, we live in a shallow world, a world of shallow values, instant gratification, and quick fixes. And what Edward de Bono is promising is instant success, easy, fun, painless thinking. This runs contrary to everything we know about how the mind is disciplined, how it develops its skills and abilities, how it comes to insight. What we have to emphasize is this, that learning how to think well is learning how to think with intellectual discipline. This is something that takes years. It's hard, it's often painful, it leads to confusion and frustration, and these are all part of the process. We can't take the difficulty out of thinking. There is no instant way to produce a thinker of excellence, any more than there's an instant way to produce a tennis player of excellence.
But just tell me this, I mean, in what way doesn't Edward de Bono's process work? I mean, what are the indicators of failure to you? How does it break down other than on a principle that it should be harder?
Well, in the first place, it breaks down at the conceptual level because it has all manner of things confused. Information is confused with fact. Feelings are confused with rational assessment. Judgment is confused with judgmentalism. Novelty is confused with creativity. The students are systematically being taught to think that they understand thinking when they're approaching thinking in the most superficial, simplistic manner possible. This leads quite naturally into intellectual arrogance, and we have enough of that already.
Okay, well, he accuses your way of thinking as a path to intellectual arrogance too, but now let's look at how you would do it. How would you, as a critical thinker, teach children to think?
Well, first of all, we don't want our students simply to think. They already think in a biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, and often downright prejudiced way. Their thinking is often confused, imprecise, shallow, rigid, and narrow-minded. What do we want? We want them to reason. More precisely, we want them to learn the discipline of reasoning, and even more specifically, we want them to learn to reason scientifically, mathematically, economically, sociologically, morally.
Okay, but how do you go about that?
Well, you go about that by recognizing that Well, let me take a...
Because we're making an assumption that you're both right, that teaching thinking as a specialist form is necessary. So we're making that basic assumption about both of you. So how do you practically apply your theories as opposed to Edward de Bono's?
Well, first of all, you have to begin with a basis of realism. You don't coach children in tennis. You don't assign someone who hasn't learned tennis, who doesn't understand the principles of tennis. You don't assign them to coach children in tennis. If we want to educate our children, we have to educate our teachers in the art of thinking critically and in the art of teaching others to think critically. This means we have to revamp our teacher education programs.
Yeah, but you're not, I suppose you're not really telling me at this point what the essence of critical thinking is.
You haven't asked me.
Well, it's pretty fundamental to learning how you're going to teach children to think. I mean, what are you going to teach them about critical thinking, which makes it different to lateral thinking?
The essence of critical thinking is the application of intellectual standards to your thinking. A critical thinker learns to think clearly, precisely, accurately, broadly, deeply, and purposefully. And there are specific tools that a person needs to learn, and these are not new discoveries. They're ancient tools.
Not the 6 hats?
Absolutely not. If you want to learn how to reason, for example, you have to recognize that all reasoning begins in assumptions. Edward de Bono makes his own assumptions. All reasoning uses concepts. He has his own concepts, for example, lateral thinking. All reasoning has implications. We have to look at the implications and consequences of thinking. All reasoning uses information. We have to check out our sources of information. We have to assess information. We have to analyze information. Learning how to do these things is not a matter of 6 basic tricks. It's a matter of a cultivation process over an extended period of time.
Okay.
If we want students to learn to reason historically, they have to learn to reason about historical issues.
All right, that almost sounds like taking a course in Plato and Aristotle and Socrates.
It isn't a question of the course you take, it's a question of how the course is taught.
Okay.
Right now we focus on memorization. Students are repeating back what the textbook and the teacher says.
Okay.
What students need to do is to reason philosophically in philosophy courses. They're not doing that. They need to reason biologically in biology courses. They're not doing that. They need to reason morally in ethics courses. They're not doing that, and so forth and so on.
All right. Edward de Bono, so what's wrong with the Richard Paul approach?
If you listen carefully to Richard Paul, you'd find a lot of words like superficial, instant gratification, tricks. Now, that is one of the most obvious errors of thinking, which 500 years ago people used to talk about. It's sort of ad hominem, where you use a lot of adjectives to make an argument. Whenever anyone uses adjectives, you've got to be highly suspicious of their thinking. Adjectives are just emotional flavorings. They don't say anything, they don't have any substance, so immediately you read about adjectives or hear about them, you've got to discount them. Now, the point about reasoning is only part of thinking. Reasoning is the processing part of thinking. Most of the errors in thinking don't take place in reasoning. Most of the errors in thinking are in perception, the way we look at the world, how broadly we look at it, how we structure it. And as David Perkins at Harvard found out, when he set out to find out where the errors in thinking were, he started off assuming they were in reasoning. They're not. They're in perception. And reasoning will not touch perception. Perception, you've got to think broadly, you've got to think of alternatives, and then when you've got your perceptual map, you see which one fits more closely to reality. So reasoning is only a small part of thinking. And my main objection to the Gang of Three is that what they taught Western society, that it's enough to attack, enough to blame, enough to argue, enough to debate, enough to point out the untruths, and if you remove the untruths, you'd be left with this wonderful truth, completely lacking in creative, constructive, or design energy, what we might call the lawyer-type thinking. And that's been a great hang-up for society. Most of the progress in society, that is the technological progress, has come about not through the argument system, but through the possibility system, the hypothesis in science, the vision in engineering, and so on. And this insistence that thinking is only about reasoning is very limited and very dangerous. Reasoning only follows perceptions, only follows values which you have already got. So reasoning is a service to thinking. In other words, it services the perceptions we have. And to talk about thinking as being solely reasoning is like talking about a car as having only one wheel. So the perceptual side of thinking, which is what we broaden with these methods, these tools, is important. And it's rather like saying, going back to these, quote, so-called tricks, it's rather like saying, well, cheese doesn't exist. I'm going to prove to you that cheese doesn't exist. And you say, well, yes, but it does exist. I had some last night. It's the same with these things. These things do exist, these tools. They are used. They're used by people who have produced big effects with them. So it really isn't too much use saying, well, they don't exist or they can't work. The other point, which I think is very important, is people say, unless it's complicated, unless you really have to be a philosopher to do it, then thinking isn't worth anything. It's too simple. It can't be valid. And that's a grave mistake. Anything important can be expressed simply. If it can't be expressed simply, you probably don't know what you're talking about.
Richard, Paul, Edward de Bono sees critical thinking as one of 4 wheels on a car, that you don't incorporate constructive thinking, creative thinking, you don't draw enough on perceptions.
Well, let's do a little conceptual analysis. He's using the words critical thinking and reasoning in a very narrow way. I don't use those words in a narrow way, and they are not used narrowly in the history of the mind. For example, let's take reasoning in relationship to perception. If I perceive a situation in a certain way, it's because I'm using a certain conceptual framework or set of concepts to understand it one way, let's say from the liberal standpoint. But I can, if I recognize that we always reason within a perspective, switch perspectives. I can look at the same set of facts or information or situation from a conservative standpoint. Now, if I want to master both of these standpoints, I have to understand how they're constructed. I have to understand their basic assumptions. I have to understand the concepts and how the concepts interrelate. This takes time. It is not something that you learn simply and quickly.
So, when you say time, what do you mean?
I mean years. The cultivation of the mind, the development of intellectual discipline, leading to traits of mind such as intellectual humility, intellectual responsibility, intellectual integrity, intellectual consistency. These take an extended period of time.
All right,
again,
but critical thinking in the end should cover all aspects of thinking.
By critical thinking, I mean thinking which embodies standards of excellence which are applied to the thinking by the thinker. Critical thinkers are those who learn to assess their own thinking and to improve the quality of that thinking through the use of appropriate intellectual standards, such as clarity, accuracy, precision, breadth, depth, purpose.
So from where you stand, what was lateral thinking called before Edward de Bono coined the phrase?
Open-mindedness, the willingness to consider an alternative perspective, the willingness to look at a situation from a new vantage point. This is ancient. Socrates was a master of looking at things from various vantage points and was interested in inquiring into the alternative points of view of many. But he didn't simply accept these various points of view. He looked into their fundamental assumptions and found that often under the jargon of that day, where people were providing a lot of quick fixes for ancient Greece, there were a lot of contradictions, inconsistencies, and incoherencies covered up by smooth talk.
Okay. Edward de Bono?
Well, this notion of taking time is a sort of thing like medicine, that unless it's unpleasant, it can't be doing you good. The taking time doesn't follow at all. You can learn a creative process literally in 5 minutes, and you can apply it and make millions of dollars with it, as indeed people have done. And that takes maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. You could probably learn it in 2 minutes. So this notion of time isn't necessary. Secondly, with regard to Socrates, Socrates never set out to be a constructive thinker. Socrates would say to someone, what is justice? And someone would say, justice is giving back to a person what belongs to that person. Socrates would listen. And then he'd say, wait a bit, he'd say, suppose you borrowed a knife from your friend, and then your friend became mad and became violent. Should you give him his own knife back? In other words, Socrates set out to challenge thinking. He was not in any sense a constructive thinker, nor is lateral thinking just the acceptance of other points of view. That would be very weak. Lateral thinking is to do with deliberate changing of concepts and perceptions, which is quite different from just accepting them, methods for changing them. So this notion that thinking has to be very tedious and complex and playing with words, and indeed Socrates was trained as a sophist. Sophists were people who were trained to play with words, and if you paid them enough, they would reach any conclusion you liked, rather like a lawyer today. You pay him and he'll argue a case on either side. And that's not particularly constructive thinking. The weakness of the argument method is, as I said before, the notion that if you find the truth, everything is wonderful. And indeed what happened in the former Soviet Union, where they not only had normal Western and Hegelian thinking, but made worse by Leninism and dialectical materialism, that you had to have a clash to make progress. So when they said, well, let's get rid of the old regime because it's bad, they did that, and then they expected everything to be wonderful, which of course it wasn't. Then they said, we can't proceed unless we have enemies, so let's make enemies of each other with the chaos we have today. And that is the essence of the notion that you can only proceed by attacking untruth and you find the truth. It's rather like a prospector digging for gold. Remove the dirt, wash the nugget under the tap, you have this wonderful truth. In contrast,
creative thinking is not something new. We've had creative thinkers for generations. We've had creative thinkers before the 20th century, and they didn't have Edward de Bono's training. Creative thinking and critical thinking are intimately interrelated.
We also had
the production. Can think creatively.
Sorry, Richard Paul.
We also had the notion of how roast pork was discovered. In China, there was a pagoda which burnt down, and there was a pig in the backyard, and the pig got burnt, and that's how roast pork was discovered. It doesn't mean we have to burn down pagodas every time we want roast pork. Of course there have been ideas. There always have been ideas. There always will be ideas, but we can get them more directly. Doesn't exclude them always happening.
With the time that we've got left, and it's not long, and I'll have to ask you both to answer it as briefly as you can, but I'd like to return to the original issue and how best to teach children to think. Edward de Bono, briefly, how do we evaluate your methods to establish that you're right and Richard Paul is wrong? Because it seems to me that people will often still arrive at the correct answers or solutions, whether they use your 6 hats or Richard Paul's formula.
No, I think that's not so. The point about teaching thinking is you must have things which are simple and effective. And when, for example, in business people have taken up the 6 hats, they find it's much more powerful than argument. They reduce meeting times by 75%. That's a pretty good indication of something tangible and something measurable. It doesn't mean that you are going to arrive at all the same answers. Using the creative tools, you will arrive at ideas which you would not have otherwise arrived at. The test of thinking is whether it is feasible, whether it is simple to teach, whether it is simple to use, whether people can use it.
Richard Paul, it seems to me that over the years Edward de Bono has actually persuaded a lot of people. Now, whether you think he's wrong or not, he's certainly reached them. How do you, in the end, demonstrate that you're right and he's wrong?
The demonstration for the power of reasoning and the importance of reasoning in physics, in biology, and chemistry has already been established. Physicists recognize the power of reasoning. Every article that is sent to a journal of physics or chemistry or math, the reasoning is what is examined. That's what is assessed. This is how we determine the quality of the work that is being done. And we know how to introduce students into historical reasoning in physics. The problem is we haven't done it. We haven't done it because our teachers have not learned to reason historically. They have gone through the school system and they have learned to memorize and repeat back formulas. We have to recognize that if we want our students to learn to think, we have to teach our teachers how to think. And there's no easy, simple formula for doing that.
Okay, well, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks very much to the pair of you for joining us tonight. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Now let's take a look at what's making headlines in tomorrow's newspapers. The Financial Review says the government's main rural and mineral price forecaster has predicted an increasingly